Welcome to the adventure where silence is louder than words, where every breath is a choice and every night is a skill. So, today we're going to be looking in on the philosophy of the Japanese samurai, a manner of living defined by tranquility, discipline, and the night. This, isn't about sword fights or blingy armor or, giant talking spiders. This is a story about a sword that's not visible. The mind. How does a warrior remain calm in chaos? What is discipline if no one is watching? Why, too, does the night, dark and still, endless, have such a sacred place in the heart of a samurai? Watch till the end, not just for knowledge, but to feel something. And when it's over, tell us in the comments, how are you feeling right now? The samurai didn't pursue peace in order to avoid conflict. They pursued peace because they'd already cultivated it within. Their tranquility wasn't naivety in a world of political upheaval, changing alliances and sudden death. It was resistance, a willful revolt against anarchy, to wake up every day with the possibility that this may be your last. And still, you bow to the morning light, drink tea with all the patience in your body, and tie on your armor with the deferential grace you normally reserve for prayer. That is the samurai way. They were trained killers, yes, but they were trained, really, in stillness. The sword was merely an extension of that, a noisy exclamation point to a sentence of quiet. The term Bushido, the way of the warrior, was not simply about fighting. It was a moral code, duty, loyalty, honor, but nestled deep in all of those grand words was something small and terrifyingly beautiful. Control. Not over other people, over oneself. Discipline wasn't punishment to a samurai. It was freedom. The world is noisy. The ego screams. Desire barks orders, but the disciplined mind, the one that bends to structure, to order, to habit, becomes a fortress that no chaos can conquer. The samurai didn't wait around for inspiration. Their swords and their hearts glittered raining, burning, or still. Discipline wasn't a mood, it was a who. Calm wasn't optional. Calm was a blade. And the calmer the lake, the more it reflects. The samurai practiced maintaining the minds resembling that lake. They wouldn't flinch when arrows rained. They listened when adversaries bellowed. When death was only inches away, they gazed into its eyes, a depth of frost and flame at once. For to be calm in safety is no virtue. But to be cool in danger, that is mastery, and then there is night. The night wasn't just a backdrop to the samurai, it was a teacher. Daylight rewards action, night rewards reflection. And the samurai also knew that action without reflection is hollow. After fights, after meals, after the sulking, they'd just sit in the dark, not fearing it, not filling it, but meeting it. Night murmured the things day was too loud to speak, the weight of mortality, the pulse of intuition. The frail strip holding blade to flesh, flesh to duty, and duty to purpose. They would sit and think beneath the trees of the stars or of the dim candle, or with the sword unsheathed and lying across their knees as a question. What if tomorrow never comes? Did I act with honor? Did I speak with clarity? Did I walk the path or stray? The night was not rest. It was revelation. To the samurai, even death was not a fear, but an attendant. They brought it with them in poems composed on the eve of battle, in their death before death. The day-by-day practice of dying, of imagining their death in detail intentionally, so that they would not panic when it did come. They would simply say hello to it as an old friend. Calm is only the counterbalance of not having done anything yet. Discipline is freedom's foundation, and night is the glass of which the warrior makes use. And that's why you are not taught to be a samurai. You unfold into it. It's not a mask you put on, it's a silence you learn to inhabit. They didn't talk much, but when they did, it was in poetry. Not because it was cute, but because when words can be your last, each one must cut with precision, like a blade, like a vow, like truth. Their code was oral, but their presence was inscribed in the air. Victory was not their calling. They stared at failure and did not blink. Discipline was waking up at dawn and shining your armor before anyone else did, not because the king would inspect it, but because you wanted to be proud of it, because you wanted to be strong enough to tame all your fears before Camlan did. Discipline meant you practiced the strength of your arm not for blood, but so that if blood someday must be spilled, it was done in clear-eyed fashion, not rage. Rage clouds judgment, and a samurai cannot have clouds. The night was time to practice your own funeral, not in grisly fetishism, but in tender thanksgiving. If I wake, so wake my spirit. Wake with me living tight on the bodies. I bore on the clean, sharp calm of my life. To pass out is not to sleep like a samurai. It's to sink into silence with awareness. Rest itself was part of their art. Everything was art. The way they walked, sat, ate, drew their blade, sheathed it. The way they died. Especially the way they died. We call it honor, but for them it was simply alignment. The outer matched the inner, which is why they were afraid of nothing, because they concealed nothing. Their anxieties got burnt in training, their misgivings drowned by discipline, egos that were cut open by reflection. The samurai gets romanticized by everybody. They see epic duels, cherry blossoms, slow-motion sword clashes, but the spirit of the thing was more subdued, lonelier, more pick and shovel than trumpet. You didn't become a samurai to put on a show. You became one because not being one would have meant betraying your soul. That is why their stories continue to resonate. Because in this noisy, abrupt, convenience-addled world, the notion of someone who travels slowly, deliberates carefully, talks rarely, and sleeps on it is like a ghost, or maybe a prophecy, and perhaps that's why you've come here. Maybe you're tired of noise, of scrolling, of playing at being many things while you know you are none. Perhaps you long for the clarity of one way, one sword, one truth. Then, listen. Calm is not a thing you find, it's something you become. Discipline is not a prison, it's the door out. And the night is not empty. It's packed with whispers, but you have to be really still to hear them. Beneath the apparently placid surface, of course, lie tensions. Not those that erupt, but those that bind everything together. The samurai understood this. They weren't born calm, they forged calm. Just as the steel was beaten into a state of stillness in the heat, so too the samurai's tranquility was forged by repeated exposure to discomfort until the discomfort was powerless, its weapon quenched. Picture yourself on your knees in the cold, long before dawn, as still as stone, when all your muscles are aching to move. Your head is yelling that you need to get away from the screens, but you do not yield. Why? For to give in to comfort, after all, was the beginning of surrender. not in battle, in being. For the samurai, his real enemy was inside. The piece that flinched, that doubted, that hesitated. Every wordless morning, every frozen meditation was war on that inner helplessness. And the only acceptable resolution would be victory. They had trained for years to not budge, not in battles but in mind, to think rationally when the blood is upraised, to have been most accurate at the moments when time vanished. Calm wasn't peace, it was dominance over panic, over reaction, over noise. But how do you train that? How do we practice stillness while the world around us spins? You subtract. The samurai shaved off all the excess, words, movements, desires. The room was simple, the armor was functional, even the tea deliberate. For them, simplicity was not the absence of anything, it was focus. The blade need not be ornately decorated to cut, it needs edge, and so did they. Their whole day was ritual, not to ritualize routine, but to inscribe meaning onto motion, delicately cleansing. The face felt enlivening. Dressing was preparation, eating was fuel, sitting was presence. Even by tying a knot in their armor, they were in a dialogue between intention and action. Nothing was wasted. Each movement was a kind of shield and prayer. And then came the sword. To the samurai, the sword was not a weapon, it was identity. They didn't flail it. They didn't draw it often, and when they did, that was it. They held the sword the way they held their soul, sharp, under wraps, unveiled only when came damned time. Pulling a blade was a statement that you were ready to die or to kill, and that was never to be taken lightly. There was no end to their sword practice. It's not that they used it every day, but more than they ever knew when they might. It wasn't the repetition of the drill that mattered, it was the preparation. Your muscle memory is your soul memory. There isn't much room for thought at the end of the day, only to be. The same applied to words. Samurai didn't fill silence. They said nothing until words counted, and when it came, they spoke, as if drawing a blade, deliberately, quickly, with impact. Their poetry was minimal, their advice sparse. But the weight behind it? Immense. A single phrase could cleave a lie in two or sew a wound, and at night, when nobody was looking, that's where they made their bones. Because the night poses a question the day never does. Who are you when there is no one to see you? The response to this from the samurai was not words, but deeds. They sharpened their swords alone, they meditated alone, they faced their fears alone, because honor wasn't about the mob, it was about the mirror. Recognition is something a lot of people desire. The samurai craved alignment. They were not afraid of being forgotten. It was a fear of not knowing who they were, and so their discipline in private was more vigorous than in public. Because they knew darkness never sustains the lie. They were plagued by the fear that they were unworthy of their sword, that this emblem of life and death could belong today to someone who had not earned it. That was an impossibility, so they earned it daily, through sweat, through silence, through sacrifice. Discipline, for them, was the glue that bound an identity. Without it, you unraveled. You succumbed to moods, temptation, fear. But with discipline, who you were became armor. Not the sort that bounces off arrows, the sort that bounces off chaos. There was no such thing as calm, discipline, night. They were coordinates. They made a triangle of clarity. Inside that triangle, the samurai stood the way a shrine did, a living philosophy, not loud, not proud, just present. For in a world of warriors seeking war, the most dangerous, man was the one who had already conquered himself. You can bet all the samurai knew time is a blade too, it cuts whether you swing it or not. A second spent is a slice not regained. That's what made their lives a presence. To walk, to breathe, to pour tea, all of it carrying the gravitas of a person who knows that there is no guarantee of tomorrow. They weren't serene because they controlled time. It came from respecting it. They did not hurry, since to hurry is just another form of panic. And panic is weakness. The samurai moved slow, but they were never tardy. They were slipping, mountain waterfalling, sliding, moving through space like water on a mountainside, the sound of it all the time going with them, and still everything around them remained calm, immovable. Their time was not measured by the hours, but by endowment, for it was better to do one calm act than 100 angry ones. That philosophy bled over into how they handled conflict. They didn't seek it, but they didn't steer clear of it either. They knew something that the modern mind often forgets. Peace is not the absence of strife. It is the mastery of it. As those shake, the ability to stand, to draw the sword, not in the madness of hate, but in the fever of necessities. To draw the sword, not on religion, but on life. And to draw it faster than you would be able to sheath it. Because revenge was noise, pride was noise, real power, that was silence. The samurai, you see, trained to a level beyond that to which most will have ever been exposed, but not just for battle. They trained for restraint. A man who can kill and cannot kill, that is presence, that's power. The undisciplined mistake impulse for freedom. The samurai knew better. Freedom doesn't mean being able to do what you want. It means being free of having to. That's why the overnight hours were so important. In the bright sunshine, it's easy enough to do the right thing. Eyes are on you. But then, at night, when no one is looking, you reveal your truth. Will you maintain the ritual? Will you learn to sit with your failures? Will you clean your blade, the inside and the outside? Many a warrior would have battled bravely. The samurai had rhythm while fighting. Breath in, step forward. Breath out, strike. Even their heartbeats had been taught to remain steady. If it sped up, they noticed. When the mind drifted, they came back. This incessant rounding was the true training. It was more than swordsmanship, it was presence. They didn't trust adrenaline, they trusted preparation. Adrenaline fades, technique remains. And when death danced near, the ready were left standing. Samurai discipline wasn't chilly. It was sacred. Each act was a prayer for form and function. There was even acceptance of failure, not as loss, but as mirror. To fail in silence was to know yourself. No blaming, no hiding, just adjusting. Again and again, before the mistake was no longer inside your body. And when the sun set at last, they did not fill the night with fire and laughter. They greeted the night as they would a long-absent teacher, the silent kind, that is, the kind that doesn't speak, but that begs to be heard, to everything you overlooked in the daylight, the emotions under the carapace, the grief that would not stow in a sheath, before the regrets were buried by reputation. For in the end, even the noblest warrior bears a shadow, and at night, if you are bold, you can walk next to them. A lesser-known custom of many samurai was a solemn one, composing a death poem. A couple of lines, often written the night before battle. It wasn't superstition. It was surrender. Not to death, just presence. A way of saying, I am not scared. I have already lived. My tomorrow influence won't go to waste. It counts, regardless. That's the paradox. The closer they got to death, the more intensely alive they were. Every breath was deliberate, every step precise, every goodbye final. Not because of fear, but because of respect. You might think this style of life is dead, but look around. Amid the noise, the distractions, the surface-level goals, doesn't something feel off? Perhaps the answer isn't just more. Maybe it's subtracting, going back to one truth, one path, one breath. Calm, discipline, night, not just prayers, but a way to sharpen your life. A samurai's life was not constructed, it was carved. They were whittled down to their bare essence. This was not minimalism for its own sake. It was survival. They didn't want extra. Extra gets in the way. Extra slows the hand, distracts. The eye blunts the edge, so they cut and kept cutting. Their homes were sparse. The tatami mats, a stand to hold a sword, maybe a scroll with one line of calligraphy hanging on a wall. That line was as good as you got to changing a mood, redirecting a thought, steadying a heart. One line. For when your life is concentrated, even one word will strike like thunder. This wasn't about being cold. They felt so much. Love, loyalty, grief, loss. That the emotional gets in the way of the intentional. Emotion is a wave. He let it come crashing down, but he was not drowned. They watched, listened, learned, then acted. And that's where discipline encountered grace. There's a myth out there that discipline is stubborn, that it's dry, lifeless. But the samurai defied expectations. Their discipline moved. It ran through tea ceremonies, sword kata, and periods of silent reflection. It wasn't robotic, it was rhythmic. A heartbeat cultivated to remain, unfazed amid pressure, to find calm within, even as the body was beaten with explosive speed. They didn't divorce art and war, they were the same thing. Drawing a sword was choreography. To arrange flowers was to wage war against chaos. To sip tea was meditation. Walking on gravel in sandals was a lesson in sound, in presence. Everything mattered, every act was deliberate. For in a life where death is always lurking, nothing is small. You don't have to be in war to be like that. The enemy, these days, isn't armed. It's distracted. It's scrolling. It's the jumping from task to task, from craving to craving. The modern war is attention, albeit one that samurai had already mastered centuries ago. Total presence. No multitasking. No noise. Try doing one thing at a time and pay close attention. No rushing. None of that looking at your phone while mid-breath. Just the thing, completely. That's what a samurai did. And they trained until it wasn't effort. It was identity. That's what people don't get. You don't try to be focused. You become someone who simply is. Through repetition. Through pruning. Through fire. And talking of fire, the night was fire this way and that. Not literal flames, but the inner kind. The sort that blazed behind shut eyes. At night, the samurai became still once more, not to sleep, to reckon. Every night was a review, a quiet inventory. Did I live today the way I intended to live? I could have spoken the truth or the convenience. Are these the actions of a warrior such as I profess to be? If not, they created no alibis. They made changes. Night wasn't escape. It was exposure. The hour of the day when everything superfluous is stripped away. No armor, no audience, just you. And the gravity of your decisions. This is why the samurai inspired fear, not only for what they could do, but for what they would not do. They would not compromise their code for convenience, wouldn't act out of ego, wouldn't run from the truth. That's not just rare, that's unstoppable. They were alarmingly stoical for other people. Just because we're used to people reacting, the samurai didn't. They responded slowly, precisely, and only when it mattered. You
can't feign that sort of stillness.
It has to be earned, in early mornings, in lonely nights, in decisions no one applauds, in restraint that nobody sees. That is why so many dreaded them, not just as a result of raising their voices, but simply because they didn't have to. The world expects chaos. The samurai gave it silence, and in the silence, everything changed. For the most part, people act like they're invincible until something breaks. The samurai were living as though they were already ghosts. This was what made them strong. They didn't deny death, they rehearsed it. Not with fear, but with purpose. Any morning could be the last. Nothing dramatic, nothing poetic or grand or imaginative. So they made their beds exactly. They polished their blades, even if no battle was on the docket. They paid homage to the rising sun as if it were their farewell to the world, because one day it would be. This allowed them an advantage most people do not understand. Detachment, not coldness, not numbness. Freedom, that's what you feel when you're not grabbing onto life with those moist hands. They gripped their responsibilities and their relationships and their behaviors like a sword, tightly, but with eyes wide open, loosened and barely ready to fall, not because they didn't care, but because they cared too much to grip. This is the paradox. The samurai weren't scary because they sought death, but because they did not fear it. And people who don't fear death are scary to people who fear life. That's why they could be slow in fast times. Why were their eyes soft amidst so much blood? Why they showed no reaction to insult or praise. They'd already been there, with their shadow, alone under the night, for a long while. There's a line in Zen, sit, just sit, and if you're lucky, you'll get bored. Boredom to the samurai was a present. It meant that you had at last stripped away the distractions. Now the hard work could start. Sitting in stillness, looking at your mind the way an opponent would, observing it, panic, beseech, fib, suffer, and not responding. Most people run from this. They fill silence with sound. The samurai honed silence as if it were a blade. And when they rose up from that silence, they didn't return to the same world. They went back sharper, cleaner, with fewer illusions. That's the power of calm. It's not softness, it's weaponized clarity. Discipline was the shield. It wasn't for the sake of suffering alone that they were predisposed. It was a matter of embracing structure before life imposed it. For most people, it takes hitting a wall to get them to do anything. The samurai constructed the wall and confronted it every day in training. Wake up before the sun, train before the body feels like it, eat before they get to the point which distraction becomes hunger. Sleep is the best cure for the weariness that is fatigue, not because they were ordered to, but because they chose to deny rule by impulse. They didn't wait for meltdown to take things seriously. They were serious first. Now, the night. We romanticize darkness or we flee from it. The samurai did neither. They sat in it, let it speak. The night was their confessional, their dojo, their forge. No crowds, no duels, only them and the reverberation of what they chose. They would write by candlelight, short lines, haiku, poems shaped like blades, thoughts not to be communicated but to be outlived. I leave no trace behind. Even in the cherry bloom, I vanish like snow. Simple, final. A reminder that legacy wasn't created in the midst of noise, but in the face of integrity. If nobody remembered their name, no matter, so long as they did. That's the heart of it. Many live to be remembered. The samurai lived to be real, and by real, I mean ruthless honesty, especially in solitude, especially in the night. They weren't perfect. They didn't pretend to be, but they were exact. Every word, every movement, every breath in sync. That alignment was their protection. That silence was their sword. So, when the morning came once more, they rose not as men in pursuit of purpose, but as purpose in pursuit of men. There's a silence that's not empty. It's alive. That's the silence in which the samurai lived, not awkward, not blank, but sharp, full, alert. The silence that listens to itself, the sort that has an air sniffing to detect a lie, before it's even been spoken to it. That's the kind of quiet you get living on the edge of life every day, on purpose. The samurai spoke only if the silence allowed him to. Words were like money, and every sentence was an exchange, building something up or tearing something down. They wouldn't gossip, flatter, complain. That wasn't mere rudeness, it was dishonorable distractions. He who talks too much hides something. A samurai hid nothing, and that's why even when they said nothing, their presence was heavy. And when they did speak, you listened. Their words had been chosen like weapons, precise, essential, and taken up only when absolutely necessary. A quarrel could end sometimes with a single phrase or start a war. They understood that calm truth is more damning than screams could ever be. This was part of their training, not just in doing, but restraining. Anyone can swing a sword, but to keep from hitting when every fiber screams to strike, that's power. And the samurai had been prepared for that moment. Since anyone is capable of being aggressive, but to withhold with force, that's mastery. They had better timing than lots of people. The blade cannot be early or late, just like a decision, just like a goodbye, just like a death, and timing, like everything else, was rhythm to nature. The samurai followed the seasons, not the clock. Spring was growth, summer was doing, fall was releasing, winter was reflecting. They didn't fight these cycles, they allowed them to make their decisions for them. Forcing bloom in winter is foolishness, kind of like attempting to fight before you're prepared, or fiercely grasping something that should be released. Night was winter, every day ended in it, and there was something every samurai understood. If you do not honor your winter, your spring will not be vibrant. So they moved into the darkness, not in sadness, in sincerity. They reflected without pity. They took to reviewing their weaknesses as if they were weapons to be honed. Where did I hesitate? Where did my ego interfere? What did I do today that I would not respect?
If I had seen it from a distance. This wasn't journaling, this was training for the next day, the next battle, the next choice. And the enemy was sometimes a thing, not a person. It was fatigue or pride or fear. The samurai were trained
to kill them first. Long before any duel began, we tend to think of enemies as external. The samurai didn't enjoy that choice. The real enemy to them was inside, in hesitancy, in comfort, in self-delusion. That enemy had many faces, and all of them looked like someone you knew. So they honed not only their blades, but also their eyes, inward. They saw the king lie before it flowered into behavior. They intercepted the doubt before it could voice itself. They also saw when emotion tried to pass itself off as logic and shut it down. That's why they seemed to move effortlessly. It wasn't.
Natural. It was earned in endless, unseen skirmishes.
Fought at night, alone. And here's the hidden truth. That war never stopped. The old samurai, those retired from the cutting edge, still subscribed to the code. They did not settle into comfort. They deepened into stillness. Their sword was stowed, though not their guard. For real samurai, after all, the fight was never restricted to the battlefield. It was always about becoming a better man, a cleaner soul, a quieter mind, a sharper edge. Not that anyone was watching, only the night had been because the night always was. Some warriors fight to win. The samurai fought not to lose themselves. That's a totally different game. Winning can be loud, external, celebrated, but not losing yourself, that's internal, invisible. Plus, nobody applauds when you get it right. It's easy to lose yourself. One compromise at a time, one shortcut, one lie you let slide. Once you shut down your gut, that's what most people do fall with. Not a bang, but a slow fade. The samurai knew this, which is why they built the ramparts of their lives. So high, not out of stone, out of habits, out of rituals, out of codes that didn't just bend because they were tired or tempted or lonely. Each ritual was a defense against erosion of becoming something debased. After training, washing the blade, though never really dirty, the ritual reinforced the fact that tools ought to be respected even when dormant. Making tea with utter concentration, not because anyone was coming, but because how you do anything is how you do everything. Even in solitude, between no one, you make your identity sharp. And that's when the actual work is done. That's when the samurai got sharpest, because this is what they knew. If you can't lead yourself, you have no business leading anyone else. Calm wasn't something they used in stressful situations. It had been baked into them. Practice, adversity, understanding. So when the pressure arrived, they didn't stay calm, they were calm. It was because that's what they had constructed. Most other people wait for peace to be warriors. The samurai were trained for chaos, not because they desired it, but because its necessity was understood. They had a sense that a storm was to arrive at some point, so they made themselves to fit in it. And not only do you stand, you move through it with grace, with clarity, with the silence that makes people pause and question everything. But here's the hard truth. You can't fake this. You can't read a book and have it. You can't dress up in a kimono and consider yourself a samurai. You have to
Bleed for it.
in silence, in choices, by saying no to what feels good and yes to what aligns, over and over again, until you aren't motivated by it anymore, because you've come to embody discipline itself. Discipline isn't chains, it's sharp edges. It cuts away weakness, confusion, noise. And the further you advance in discipline, the lighter you become. Not heavy with pressure, light with purpose, simple, direct, focused, unshakable. And that is why the samurai slept soundly. Not tired, but empty. Nothing left unsaid, nothing left untrained. No lie they hadn't faced. They earned their sleep. The way they got respect inch by inch, not from fear, but from presence. And in that darkness, before sleep, they went back once more to the night. Not to run to listen, because at night the truth shouts. It's when the personae dissolve into the false identities, It's when the ego goes quiet. That's when you can finally hear the question, are you living like you'd want to die? And if the answer was no, they fixed it. Not tomorrow. Not when it was convenient. Now, because samurai didn't believe in someday, they had faith in today, played clean, and tonight honored all the way. And tomorrow went into with nothing unsaid, unlearnt, or unresolved. That's why they were ready to die. Not because life had no value, but because they were squeezing all of it into their days. That's how they won, even when they fell. A samurai didn't say to themselves, well, what do I feel like doing today? The question they asked was, what must be done and how can I do it beautifully? That is a person who is dangerous, one who doesn't get in line, one not reliant on mood, one that does not feed on applause. They're not, though, because they're not playing the same game. Their life was not about seeking pleasure and avoiding pain. It was a matter of alignment, of belief, of rhythm, of argument. And that meant showing up at the hardest times, especially then, for ease was never the yardstick. Excellence was. That's why you saw their movements were not forced. Not that they bypassed the struggle, but because they ingested it. Thousands of silent, punishing repetitions, hours of lonesome training in chilly rooms before dawn, no cameras, no audience, just a blade, a breath, a standard. And here is that part that people overlook. And that training wasn't only on the battlefield, it was for the mundane, the way they stood, sat, listened. Even when silent as they carried, it all mattered. Purpose, stillness. Because there's a funny thing that happens when you train the body to move with intentions, and the mind follows. So once you have that external straightened out, you face the internal. And when you're able to do both, you don't need to fake being in alignment. You radiate it. That's how they could control a room without ever opening their mouths. That's why so many stepped aside without being asked, because the samurai did not require respect. They embodied it. And that embodiment did not begin in duels. It started in discomfort. You see, the samurai didn't pursue comfort. They trained themselves out of dependence on it. They realized comfort was a snare. The more you pursue it, the more powerless your will becomes. So they flipped the script, made discomfort their dojo, sat in it, breathed through it, owned it. You could abandon a samurai in the midst of a blizzard and come back days later. There he'd be, kneeling in the snow, eyes wide open, unblinking. Not because they weren't waiting for the world to do so. They had altered themselves to fit the world. Now enter night again. The darker the night, the brighter the truth. This is the moment that the shallow parts of life become a hindrance. The career title, the followers, the distractions. Everyone's in the dark. None of it matters. All that remains is essence, your breath, your code, who you really are, not who you present. This is where the samurai meditated, not on what they had, but on what they represented. Not the thing they desired, but the thing they chose to trade away. There's an earthy clarity to darkness, not the light that comes from light, the light that comes from stillness. The kind that cannot be taught in a lecture or tweeted in a quote. It has to be sat with, lived, endured. The samurai endured it, and from it they learned the music.
Of the peace that does not blink, doesn't shake, doesn't seek, just is. That's the core of calm. Not feeling nothing, feeling everything and deciding your response. Discipline made it possible. Night made it visible, and calm made it undeniable. So when the sun came up, the samurai didn't awaken. They stood up. With clarity, with structure. It's nothing to prove and everything to honor. They did not pray to have a day that was easy. They wetted themselves for a good one.
Most people construct their lives the way you direct a can. Theirs, like a blade, was the samurai. Not as in piled high with clutter, but as in there's history here, layer upon layer, by fire, pressure, cooling silence. So it is that their way lives on. It wasn't only philosophy, it was physics. Steel doesn't argue, it either sticks or it snaps. So does character. The samurai had no use for half notes of themselves. Their goal wasn't an average that was better
than average.
They aimed for clean cuts, precision, clarity. They weren't just living. They elevated living into an art. They did not try to be focused. They became focus. Everything else was noise. Noise is death. In the West, we worship freedom as the ability to do what we please. Freedom, the samurai felt, was no longer being ruled by what you want. Cravings, controlled, or ego, contained. Desire, disciplined. Anything that can control you owns you, the kidnapper told Will. They did not abide by ownership. Not from monarchs, not from tempers. They lived light and died lighter. And what made them powerful? Repetition. Repeated exposure honed not only skill but spirit. Each swing of the sword wasn't just practice. It was a vote, a commitment, a shaping of the self. The swing said, "Let me be clear, I am not drift. I am deciding thousands of times a day." And this is why their training seemed like meditation, because it was. The distinction between static and mobile dissolved. The samurai inhabited that blur, that edge. 9% of individuals recoil at the word repetition. They want new. The samurai knew better. Repetition is what you do to master things. When it's for a second time, you have to work at it. The 10th try, it's technique. The 1,000,000th time, it's perception. Now the night again. Always the night, where you put your ego to bed, but not your warrioress. For the night doesn't want to know how strong you appear. It asks how honest you are. Here is where the samurai bowed their heads and cut off the armor. Well, not the metal, the emotional armor, the pride, the masks. The blade could not save them alone in the dark. Only the code could, and if they had betrayed it, even in the smallest way, they felt it like a crack in steel. They didn't hate themselves for it. They corrected. The samurai were not aiming for perfection. They strove for consistency. Perfection is an illusion. Consistency is a discipline. They arrived the same way. Rain or sun patted on the back or scolded,
agitated or tranquil.
Their identity, after all, wasn't determined by the weather. It was forged from within. And when the going got tough, great. That's where they demonstrated the blade was real. Rest for them was intentional. They didn't crash. They closed the day. Like a chapter. Like a ritual. The body rested. The mind reviewed. The spirit breathed. So when they got up again, it wasn't with baggage. It was with readiness. No guilt, no chaos, just the next breath, the next act, the next step on the path. That's what made them frightening. Not their skill, but their core. You couldn't rattle them. You couldn't tempt them. You couldn't make them blink. So when you've spent, every single night of your life looking death in the face, life becomes simple. A samurai didn't wait for gods to spell things out. They became it. For the samurai had not always known the outcome, nor relied always on experience itself. They had trusted preparation. Doubt starves to death in the presence of discipline. That's why failing to decide was lower than failing. Mistakes can be corrected by you, but from inaction. That cost is permanent. And here's the oddity. They were not moving fast. Ever. Because urgency is not speed. Urgency is presence. It's just doing what needs to be done, whole cloth, now. Not frantically, but totally. Their silence was not a slowness. It was depth. When a samurai entered a room, time felt a bit slower. Not because they were magical, but because they had nothing extra on them. No guilt, no regret, no confusion of stories in their head.
Nothing but the instant, tipped like a drawn blade. That's what happens when you're living congruent. When what you do and what you think and what you value are layered and lined, there is nothing you cannot do. You move as a river moves.
Silent, unstoppable, shaped with purpose. And that alignment didn't just happen on its own, it was engineered every day. Wake up, bow, breathe, move with care, train with fire, speak with precision, sleep with awareness. This rhythm wasn't boring, it was sacred because chaos hates rhythm. And the samurai weren't made for chaos, they were made to stop it. But here's what no one tells you, it's not easy. It's never been easy. It's not as though the samurai were born different. They took this path every single day, through discomfort, through repetition, through brutal honesty, not once, always. And that's why they were dangerous, because nearly everyone crumbles under pressure. The samurai gets keener under it. Pressure wasn't something to be feared. It was a challenge.
An invitation even, an opportunity to rise, to demonstrate to yourself what you have built inside is stronger than what the world hurls at you outside. Now the night. Again. Always the night. It wasn't just for rest. It was for refining. The dark wiped out all rank, all ceremony.
It asked only, did you code live today? If the answer was no, the samurai did not run. They adjusted. No self-pity, no performance, just correction. They understood that the magnitude of their victories didn't matter, only how they
handled the adversity of failure, and failure to them was just feedback.
The world's way of saying sharpen some more, which is why their discipline never grew softer. As they grew older, it grew more stark. They did not chill over time. They deepened. It was like water that looked still on top and yet moved powerfully underneath. That power came from peace. But peace, not as the absence of conflict. Peace by living up to their code in all circumstances, even when it was difficult, especially when it hurt, because that's the hiding place of transformation. Not in ease, in fire, in opting for the way that makes your legs tremble, of the ability to keep your word when no one would ever know if you didn't, and you could see it in their eyes. Not cold, not soft, just clear, as though they had already gazed upon the back of the book and had chosen to live in such a fashion that they weren't afraid. For when death is no longer a foe, every moment is sacred. Every gesture is a note. Every breath a ceremony. That's the real secret. They were not trying to impress. They were trying to vanish into truth, to live so clean that nothing false could adhere to them, not even their name. The second component of the samurai's way starts not with doing, but with seeing. They studied before they moved. They held out before they struck. The samurai didn't simply look. They watched. The movement of a leaf in the wind, the tension in a horse's breath, the flicker in an opponent's eye. There were omens all around the world, and the disciplined warrior knew that each of them was a threat or a wile. People rush because they're afraid of what the stillness
Can bring. A single samurai attack is slow until speed becomes imperative. Then it is final. In the night, when the hum of the village fades, you hear your true thoughts. So it was that the night was a peril for many. But the samurai welcomed it.
for the most ran from their shadows while the samurai had lain near to theirs. Discipline taught them this. Your shadow is not your enemy. It's your map. It tells you where you haven't looked. It's what you won't look in the face. And the samurai didn't seek to defeat themselves. They hoped that if they understood themselves well enough, there would be nothing within them to use against them. You cannot shock a man who has already sat alone in silence with incarnations of himself. That is why peace was so deadly. It wasn't the lack of emotion or was, it was the command of it. Anger still bubbled but didn't dominate. There were still whispers of fear, but it was not the one taking orders. Ego still roamed, but it was on a leash. And every night, these furiosi fell in line, like insubordinate soldiers, and were lined up by discipline. Not ignored.
Not killed, controlled. It's a different kind of strength, and it's not visible in battle, but before battle. The samurai were not monks, they were warriors.
But their discipline was the reflection of spiritual intensity. They didn't swing wildly, they didn't waste breath. They hardly ever talked if speech was not precipitated by necessity. Their song was like their sword, sharp, needful, and short. And in the silence of night, they practiced speaking without sound, a raised eyebrow, averted eyes, a nod. The world is loud today because people use noise to hide weakness. The samurai employed silence to strengthen power. If someone were to ask a samurai, what point made you become strong? The response wasn't a date, a duel, or a title. It was a process. Becoming strong was not a switch that you flipped. It was a grind of a stone.
Night of stillness, morning of repetition, painful correction from a master, humiliating failure. All would carve away the weakness. Not just physical fatigue, but mental chaos. The samurai were not just playing to win, they wanted
To be so prepared they would be incapable of failure. Not because they were so arrogant, but because they were so irreproachably prepared. That's why they took on discomfort. Hunger taught focus. Cold taught movement. Boredom taught creativity. Night taught reflection. They knew this to be a universal fact. Pain is a teacher and discipline is the lesson. So where others would shy away from pain, the samurai would take from it a lesson. While others waited for inspiration, they moved because honor does not wait. And calm. Calm was the product, though I didn't realize it at the time, of thousands of days in which I did things the hard way when nobody was watching. Rising at dawn to sweep a training yard. Waving the white flag from an enemy who never should have received it. Responding with silence to insult. These things didn't look like power, but they were power.
layer by invisible layer. Discipline made them presence. A samurai didn't fidget. He didn't slump. He didn't pace nervously. Every step had intention. Every motion had weight. This wasn't about style. It was about full awareness. The
mind was one with the body as a sword is one with the scabbard. Even when they were out of their armor, they moved like every moment counted, because to them it did. Time was sacred. Time was the one thing you couldn't buy back. So, waste of time was dishonor, not to other people, but to oneself. In a world of abundance, the samurai resided in scarcity. Their home was minimal, their possessions were few. Their weapons were more like sacred relics than toys. Even in luxury, they opted for austerity. Why? Because comfort is the enemy of the blade. And the night's whispering, out there, in the unknown, comfort will betray you. You need sharpness. And sharpness, well, it only comes from having your soul burn. And you've got to pick the heat. The night is rife with metaphor. It hides the enemy. It hides the path. But it is, after all, exposing your edge. In the darkness, you can feel more. Sense more. Listen to the terror in your own spine. And if you're able to cross the night without losing your sanity, if you can trust yourself as you wander in darkness, then no daylight rival will defeat you. Samurai did not yearn for the light. They trained for the dark. That is why they constantly seemed a step ahead. For if others are ready, when danger becomes apparent, it was there, ever ready, for the samurai. This attitude doesn't go away in old Japan. It applies now in quiet rooms, in difficult conversations, in lonely skirmishes with self-distrust. To be a modern samurai is not to wear a sword, it's to embody the same internal code, confront the darkness, welcome the stillness, and cultivate a discipline so powerful that nothing from the outside can shatter you. The samurai was not delusional that he could control the world, only himself. That was the entire game, not politics, not revenge, not even survival, mastery over oneself. That was the supreme war, the never-ending duel. And night was the field. You don't forge unshakability by avoiding storms. You become implacable by not moving while they tear out the trees around you. The samurai knew this. This is why they didn't pursue peace. They became it. At night, all of the illusions are removed. No crowds cheering in the dark, no titles, no reputation, no armor of appearance. There's only you and the question, when no one is watching, are you who you claim to be? The samurai's response had to be, yes. Not for honor, it's not even for you. But the answer, if it was no, was that they didn't pass the next test. The night was not just time. It was trial. Each hour of stagnation was a test
of commitment. Can you maintain form in the face of fatigue shouting? Can you practice form when your joints scream that you need to take a break?
Can you stand the company of your own mind when the ghosts of failure come knocking? Most can't. It is why the vast majority of people never amount to much. Calm was not taught. It was earned, won by having gone to the brink of failure.
And not flinching, by standing before a master and being corrected with no ego, by watching a brother go down in a fight and pressing on with emotion not clouding understanding.
Calm was hammered out in every fractional eruption, each deep breath, a breath of fire and anger, every act of patience when my sword hand twitched. It was too much to expect a samurai who did not act calmly, but for one who waited and listened. Before he leapt, he became a legend. And discipline? It was a way of walking, eating, thinking. You could spot who'd been trained by how they walked into a room. No rush, no excess. Even the bow was deliberate. There was beauty in that precision, not because it looked good, but because it stood for the fact that nothing was wasted. A little flick of the wrist, a moving of the foot. Everything was purposeful. It was the fact that the more a samurai disciplined themselves, the less they required. They didn't add skills, they refined essence. There's a point in night. Work like this. When your body is trembling, the candle is about to gutter and the cold settles deep in your bones, that your mind tries to wriggle out. It says stop. Sleep. You've done enough. But the samurai stays. That 1 extra hour? There's the line in the sand. Ordinary men sleep. Warriors stay. That is when the mind cracks and the spirit emerges. Then the real training starts. No, one applauds this. That's the point. The applause is not what the samurai trained for. They trained because they couldn't not train. Very softness was an opening for death. So they removed softness, not for fear, but for love of the code. And the code was everything. It dictated what you ate and how you bowed and how you died. Bushido wasn't a maxim, it was a guide for shaping your whole life, however.
Long against something that never breaks, and in a world that destroys men for sport, that alignment was priceless. The code didn't take your mood into account. It didn't give a damn how tired you were. The code, in effect, put only
one question: will you remember the way? Or will you betray the way? That question rang loudest at night. The man who has no code is at the mercy of every emotion. But a samurai could be sensitive and still act surgically, not because he was cold, but because he was schooled, trained to let feeling pass, not take over, which is why a quiet warrior was terrifying, because you could not control him. You couldn't provoke him. He did not react. He responded. And that pause, that razor's edge between stimulus and action, was where real power resided. It was this. All those night trainings in the dark and all those slashes of the blade under moon glow, all those repetitions while others slept. A man ready to die without regret. Regret lives only in the space between who you declared yourself to be and who you became. The samurai pulled even. Discipline made it so. Calm in battle isn't poetic, it's surgical. Thought flies faster than hands when the mind is still. The samurai had no use for anger in fighting. They needed breath, focus, timing. They could hear the enemy's heart beat in the fighting. They could read the pause before a blow. Such awareness doesn't arise from instinct, it comes from obsession. Obsession with the craft, obsession with form, obsession with self-mastery. But obsession has a cost, and that cost is night, the
night of loneliness, the night of repetition, the night that nobody knows why you are pushing so much, the night when they say you are uptight, intense, cold. The samurai agreed to that price, because for them, whatever others would term
intensity, they named clarity, and what others feared they prepared for. Night was not the lack of light, it was not the absence of light. It was the presence of truth. The world deceives you in the daytime, but at night the world blocks out who you are, what you're afraid
of, and whether or not you've done enough. And if the answer is no, then you go and get the sword and train again.
Time was not hurried by the samurai. They bent with it. How a bamboo will bend with the flow of wind, but it will never break. This was not submission, it was strategic stasis. Forward isn't always discipline. Sometimes it's standing your ground when everything says, flee. The night sharpened this. It didn't give answers, it opened space, and space tells the truth. Most folks can't keep quiet because the people to whom they have lied are really loud. A samurai.
Needed that echo. Why?
Because it's only in the noise of our own fear that we can begin to hear our real voice. Their education was physical, yes. But below that was something more ancient still. Pattern recognition. They trained to see. Not just blades and footwork, but purpose, feeling, vulnerability. One shift in breathing. One blink. One twitch of the left wrist. These meant something. In battle, they were everything. And how did the samurai develop the ability to see these small signals? Through calm, through watching, through stillness. So profound it was vision. But calm is most threatened not by enemies, but by the self. Insecurity, doubt, pride, which were louder than drumbeats of war in a mind out of control. That's why every form practice was a church service, a ritual, not simply of the body in motion, but of the body in retreat. Removing ego, removing excess, removing noise. One cut clean and again, and all was rhythm, breath and blade. By the full moon's light, they did more than work out. They experimented with reality. How fast is your response? How much patience can you hold without your mind betraying you? Notice your heartbeats, that too without touching your chest. Samurai understood you cannot dictate to the world, but if you can control your breath, your hands, your mind, you don't have to control the world. You pass through it like a ghost with mass. Discipline supplied the children with this freedom. Strange, right? The repression that sustained discipline was discipline itself, iron-fisted in a velvet glove. Because when you no longer require outside motivation, you are liberated. When you are immune to a mad logic, you are immune to a mad logic. And I can say, very surely, once you are immune to distraction, panic, fatigue, you are unstoppable. You can lose the fight, die indeed, but you never lose the self. And that's why they were so dangerous. Not their skill, but their lack of reaction. They did not fight for the rush. They fought from stillness. That's terrifying. We're busy AF in this modernized world, and we chase stimulation. Phones, lights, noise. But the samurai were in pursuit of emptiness. A dojo with no music, a blade with no decoration, a life with no clutter. For clarity cannot be found in the mayhem. Night was their friend, for then it was empty already. They were given the canvas to write their mastery on. The modern male is terrified of the dark alone. The samurai was afraid not to study in it, and don't be mistaken, they were not robots. They laughed, they loved, they wept for brothers fallen, but emotion, even that, had been no master to them. Love did not distract them, grief did not derail them. They hurt hard and still got back up. That's not repression, that's internal command, a kind of martial art of the emotions. Their swords didn't swing of rage, they swung from alignment. Their feelings were riders, they drove the cart. The night was their crucible, not once, but every day. There would be a fire to huddle alongside when the temperature dropped to 20 below, but every night the fire weakened again, and each morning they had to build it all over. That is why discipline wasn't a single decision. It was a loop, a vow renewed with action. Again and again and again, until even death itself was powerless to stop it. You could strip everything from a samurai, his title, his home and property, his riches, his social standing, and he'd still kneel at dawn before worshippers at an altar of one, and sharpen his blade, practice his craft as if the whole world was watching. That's not habit, That's identity, not forged in triumph, but through pounding repetition in solitude, where every prize is only the fact I did not bend. They didn't demand easier circumstances, they built harder minds. And the night, its stillness, its chill, its tests, was their forge. That fire didn't originate from anywhere
else. It was from within, and it ignited everything it touched and never burned out. You don't fake this. You do not learn it over a weekend. You become it. And when you are it, where you walk in a room, people feel it. Not because you boast, but only because you don't have to. You've already made it through the night.
The samurai didn't require motivation, or now they were already fueled by momentum. They weren't chasing highs or waiting for ideas to strike them like lightning. That's contemporary thought. Feast or famine, all or nothing. The key samurai way was another, rhythmic, not reactive. They didn't reset every Monday. They never stopped. Each day was just a continuation of the last. Not ideal, not always simple, but unbroken, because once it stops, even for a second, the rust sets in, and rust does not care about how sharp you once were. That's why they kept what they did as if it was sanctified. Mornings were for coming back into the body. Movement, breath, simplicity. Not to win the day, not to hustle, but to remember. I am a weapon. I must not dull. The movements they made in rehearsals were the movements they made in action, not practice. Reality as rehearsal. They weren't planning for if. They were preparing for when. And this was the brutal truth that guided them. When pressure comes, you don't rise to the level of your goals. You drop to your level of preparation. That is why samurai could have no notion of optional. If it was on the path, it was imperative to have it. The tea ritual was not only about tea, it was form and attention and stillness. The bow wasn't just custom, it was humility made visible. Each repetition, each breath, a vote for the kind of people they wanted to be, and yet, with all of this, the night was still their most truthful companion, for night reveals what the day cannot. There's no applause in the dark, no role to play, no one but you, the silence, and whatever truths you are still running from. That's where the actual battles were fought, not on battlefields, but in quiet rooms. Late, alone. The questions nobody else is asking. Did I act from fear today? Did I let my ego guide me? Was I useful? Or just busy? And if the answers sting, great. The samurai embraced that pain as one might a whetstone. It wasn't guilt, it was refinement. Pain didn't mean failure, it meant data. That was what
made them so unmovable. And they failed often and early. Not because they were sloppy, because they made an effort to find edges.
If there were a crack, they wished to find it while it was morning on parchment, or as the light bound the page first, not a glimpse of shadow about it. And here's what's wild. The more that they trained, the less that they had to perform. Why? Because just presence was enough. Their look could stop an argument. Their inaction could make disrespect melt away. Their quiet could alter the rhythm of a whole room, not through power games, through consistency. For when a person lives in such a way, when there is no disparity between words and deeds, between image and essence, between truth and actions, that person becomes uncommon, and the rare are always felt. That's why the samurai didn't pursue attention. They were impossible to overlook. But it wasn't for fame. It was for clarity. To be the type of individual who, if he disappeared tomorrow, would leave a life that reverberated. he lived well. He died ready, and again, the night was the ultimate test every single night, to ask before sleep if this was the last breath. Was it aligned? Was it clean? And if they didn't wallow, they vowed. And the last truth of the samurai was this: you have death on your back so you can wear life properly, not in fear, in focus, not in sadness, in sharpness. Living every day as if it's your last isn't morbid, it's freeing. When death is no longer denied, all false things fall away. You stop pretending, stop delaying, stop performing. You act cleanly. You speak deliberately. You love fully, because there is no time to be anything but true. No wonder their lives had gravity. Why their steps seemed ritualistic. Why it sounded like they had been silent for an eternity. Because comfort was already a fare thee well. To illusion, to safety, and what was left was essence, pure presence. No drag, no drama, no distortion. When a samurai gazed upon a cherry blossom, he saw more than beauty. They saw impermanence. That's why it was beautiful, because it was brief. For reminding them that everything good, love, honor, even breath, is on a timer, so you treat it with respect. You don't waste it, you don't hoard it, you honor it in action. Honor wasn't ceremony, it was pressure alignment, to act right when it's hard, to speak truth when it costs, to be still when everything is screaming to run. When death finally arrived, then as it does for everyone, the samurai didn't beg for more time. They bowed calmly, because they had not been waiting to begin life. They had been alive, minute by minute, with the intricacy that most people experience only when they are out of time. This is why their legacy retains its edge, still, cuts through history, not for the fights they had won, but for the self they could not allow to be lost. Their sword is gone, their castles are gone, but their code, still here. It is now waiting for someone to follow up on. Maybe that's you. So please tonight, before there's more glow from a screen, before the noise restarts, let the stillness enter. Just for a moment. Not what you want? Ask yourself. But what you must become, not who to impress, but what to embody. And when the sun comes up tomorrow, don't be in such a hurry. Stand, breathe, begin, as the last samurai who ever lived, because perhaps, just perhaps, you are.